next speaker is Fiammetta Rocco, who is the literary editor of The Economist in London. Now, we've invited Fiammetta to this conference, not only because she's one of the most influential and well-read arts journalists in the world, but also because being born in Kenya, of French-Italian parents, and she, I think, immediately just by being born in this part of the world, has a different approach to culture than, say, a European, although she lives in Europe and works very well within the European sector. She's enormously successful not only in the visual arts, but she's the manager of the Booker Prize in England, which is undergoing quite dramatic transformations at the moment. And at Christmas time, she wrote a report for The Economist, one of these very authoritative 10-page ambitious accounts at how you describe all of the world's museums and what's happening in their global developments. And she wrote to me and said it had come out. So I went to it, and she said, I don't know if it's read very much in Australia. So I had to go to 5 newsagents to get the remaining copy. And I noticed that this report is in the board papers of many Australian museums. She spent some time in China, studying recent museum developments, and of course read Claire's book. Today she's chosen to talk about Bring on the Culture Vultures. And she's going to talk about cultural precincts. And this is somehow or other the way that good journalists have of defining a topic that's very much of the moment. This is a subject that we want to do a symposium on with the Australian Institute of Art History. And Carrie and I, since we formed this collaboration, are going to go on and convene this together. And it's one of the hottest topics, I think, anywhere in the world. And we're just thinking about how we might work on this. So thank you ever so much, Fiammetta, for proposing this subject, which will lead us onwards. So please welcome Fiammetta Rocco.
Thank you. That's what happens to a short speaker. You have to bend everything down. Thank you to Kerry Gardner, who gave us such a fabulous evening last night at dinner for all the speakers in the most completely magical place. And thank you to Professor Anderson for inviting me here. This is my first visit to Melbourne, and I am so pleased to be here because The Economist, for which I work, has described it as the most livable city on the planet. Because Melbourne has Australia's oldest public art museum, the National Gallery of Victoria. Because it also has the biggest stained glass ceiling in the world. These are small details, but as you'll see, every detail is important. Now, 3 years ago, the American consulting group McKinsey set itself a very simple question. What makes a city great? It was very well timed. In 2008, for the first time in history, half the world's population was living in towns or cities. By 2030, 6 out of 10 people will be living in a city. By 2050, that proportion will be 7 out of 10. Here in Australia, already more than 2/3 of your population lives in your major cities. So it was perfect timing for McKinsey to ask, what makes a city great? Well, they came up with 3 answers, all of which will have a special resonance for Melbourne. First of all, you need green spaces and great public transport. Vienna, Sydney, Singapore, London, they aren't necessarily green in the modern sense, but they have the most green space in comparison to their size. So it's not surprising that those 4 cities always feature very, very high up on the list of popularity. In the late 19th century, when London had already built a subway, New York still depended on horse-drawn travel. The horses were loved They're still loved, as you can see from the debate over the mayoral campaign. They were greatly loved, but they were so slow and they were so smelly that people swarmed into the city slums just to avoid long journeys to and from work. By the mid-1890s, the Lower East Side in Manhattan was one of the most crowded places on earth. Its tenements, one recent historian has written, were wet, cold, rancid, and infested with vermin. That's not what you want if you want a great city. What you need are lots of parks, lots of clean, quick, crime-free transport. Now, the second thing you need is a lot of immigrants, and Melbourne knows this better than anybody. Immigrants bring energy, they bring investment, they bring ideas, they bring great food. All of these are things that make life better. Third, you need great culture. Just over a month ago, Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, one with the funny hair, drew a very detailed picture of what this meant when he presented a study on culture and cities to the World Economic Forum at Davos. And what he had to say was this: from ancient Athens, Renaissance Florence, and Elizabethan London, to modern cities like New York and Mumbai, cities have been the places where culture develops and moves forward. Cities can support the widest range of cultural activity. They have large audiences, both resident and tourist. They have strong business sectors, which are the source of funds, and a market for creative goods. Cities can support the high fixed costs of building cultural infrastructure, as well as the infrastructure of commissioning, management, distribution, and production. The diversity that is common to cities allows them to sustain a huge variety of art forms, while their dynamism, their constantly changing populations, their huge international connections, these are what make them hubs of new cultural ideas and knowledge. So culture gives cities a particularly distinctive appeal. In the era of globalization, world cities are increasingly competing with each other. They compete to be the headquarters of a multinational firm, or for the right to host major international sporting and cultural events. More and more, cultural prowess and economic success are interlinked like this. So those cities with historical, strong cultural offerings, London, New York, Paris, the old cities, they see culture as a vital part of their economic strength. Boris says that this is expressed in two ways. The commercial forms of culture, the creative industries, let's call them, make up a large and growing share of the economies of large cities. Culture in all its diverse forms is also central to what makes a city appealing to educated people, and hence, and this is really important, hence to the businesses that want to employ them. In the globalized knowledge economy, having a well-educated workforce is the key to success, and such workers demand stimulating, creative environments. So a rich and viable cultural center becomes in itself an indirect source of economic success. Now think of the global cities you know. We've talked about London, New York, Paris, but there's also Tokyo, Amsterdam. They all score incredibly high on the number of museums, public libraries, theaters, concert halls, comedy clubs, art galleries, cinemas, film festivals, bookshops, you name it. But they're also old cities. They've got well-established entertainment and arts districts which have developed organically over centuries often, and without any formal investment strategy. But what happens if you're a relatively new city, the capital of a country that, say, has recently struck oil? Well, especially if you've struck oil, The answer is very easy. You build your culture sector from the top down. Today, cultural infrastructure is increasingly planned on a large scale by or with the support of city government. Think of Saadiyat Island on Abu Dhabi, Beijing's Olympic Green, the Cultural District in Cultural District in Dallas, Chicago's Millennium Park, the West Kowloon District in Hong Kong, Singapore's Esplanade, with which we were talking about last night with Jean, and Doha's Mshraib District. All these are different modes of how high-profile urban developments have or are being planned to embrace cultural activities as a vital part of the public realm. Now, the inspiration for this was Bilbao. The opening of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao in 1997 showed just what an ambitious and energetic municipality could do to help turn a city round. 25 years ago, Bilbao was a small provincial town in northern Spain, and its industrial heart was dying. The Guggenheim was part of a wider development plan involving a new subway line, transport, redevelopment of the river frontage, green space, and a new airport. Frank Gehry's museum was the icing on the cake. But this is what the icing looks like in numbers. The Guggenheim is calculated to have contributed 2.5 billion euros to the GDP of the Basque province since it was inaugurated. That's about 3.8 billion Australian dollars. Many, many times what the federal government spends on the arts in this country every year. Visitor spending in the first 3 years after the museum opened raised more than 100 million euros in taxes for the regional government. That was enough to recoup all the construction costs and leave something over. Now, last year, more than 1 million people visited the Guggenheim, at least half of them from abroad. This was the third highest number ever. So the building continues to attract visitors, even though it's no longer a novelty, and to be frank, its collection is really rather modest. All of this is more impressive when you think that these results have been generated against the background of the worst financial crisis Spain has ever seen since the Civil War in the 1930s. So it's no wonder that Iñaki Azkuna, who runs Bilbao, has just been named the world's best mayor. Other cities that don't have cultural districts like this now look at Bilbao as a model for what vision and achievement can achieve. And it's not for nothing that in academic studies on urban regeneration, this is now written about as the Bilbao effect. Now, I talked to a small New York consultancy firm called AIAH, which specializes in cultural products. And they have put together an enormous spreadsheet in which they reckon that over the next decade, more than 40 new cultural districts are due to be built in various countries at an estimated cost of $250 billion. I know Rupert has made comments about statistics and things, but even then that sounds a lot, and it will undoubtedly end up being more, construction costs being what they are. Concrete has been poured for some of these projects, and some of them are still at the contract stage. They aren't really on the global agenda yet, but the list is already pretty impressive. Cairo, Cape Town, Baghdad, who'd have thought it? Baghdad, Basra, Kuwait, Beirut, Riyadh, Sharjah, Lhasa in Tibet, at least 20 cities in China, Busan in South Korea, already the center of a world-class film festival, Tirana in Albania, Vienna, Prague, Copenhagen, Helsinki, Budapest, Berlin, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, Malmö, Kiev, right across America and Canada, further south, Sao Paulo and Belo Horizonte in Brazil, Buenos Aires in Argentina, and of course, Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, and Melbourne. The most talked about projects are probably those in the Gulf, not least because we haven't seen them yet, and because their patrons are the biggest buyers of art in the world, which keeps newspapers and the auction houses agog. But they're also interesting for other reasons. Qatar and Abu Dhabi have chosen two completely different models. Abu Dhabi has decided to import culture wholesale. They've devolved responsibility for building two of their museums to the Guggenheim and the Louvre, and these will bear their names. Qatar has decided instead to focus entirely on homegrown models. They began by building an Islamic collection. Now, one of the members of the royal family, in particular, Sheikh Saud Al Thani, has spent more than 30 years buying the very best Islamic pieces that came out of the European collections that had been built up in the 19th century. And the result, built by IMP, is the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. And if you've never been to it, take it from me, it is really worth the visit. Sheikh Saud's brother, Sheikh Hassan, is interested in Orientalism, and he has an enormous collection of 19th century European Orientalist paintings, all those ladies in veils and stuff like that. But another enormous and very important collection of Middle Eastern modernism. Artists who went from Cairo, from Iraq, from Saudi even, to Europe to study in the early 19th century and came back and applied what they learnt to their own countries. I think in due course, we can expect museums devoted to these two areas to be built there. Qatar and Abu Dhabi have grown rich on oil and gas. They were lucky, but they know that one day these resources are going to run out. So they're both thinking 30 years from now, and they're devoted to creating a knowledge economy, building schools, universities, libraries, and publishing houses. And these museums are part of that policy. They want to educate their own people, but they also want to make their cities culture hubs that will attract visitors from Europe, Russia, India, and further east in Asia. And they are not the only ones. In Hong Kong, M+, the new Museum of Chinese Contemporary Art in the West Kowloon Cultural District, wants to be Asia's answer to Tate Modern. A new building has already been commissioned, and it'll be opened probably in 2017. But in the meantime, M+ has been focusing on what the Chinese call the software, the collection, building up the curators, rather than the hardware, which is just the building. And in this, it has already been quite successful. It's secured two large collections of Chinese contemporary art through a mix of gifts and purchases. One, a large holding from a former Swiss ambassador to Beijing, Uli Sig. Uli Sig was an early and incredibly energetic collector of Chinese contemporary art. He was posted to Beijing in the early 1980s, so he was a witness to the very, very early beginnings of the Chinese contemporary art movement that has now become known around the world. And in June 2012, he announced that the very large part of his collection, and that means thousands of pieces, would go to M+. The second collection M+ has secured was accumulated by a businessman called Guan Yi. It's much smaller, only 37, 38 pieces, but it's important for two reasons for M+. First of all, it includes examples of early work from outside Beijing that were shown internationally, especially of the artists from the Pearl River Delta. And secondly, Guan Yi is a young businessman from mainland China, and he might have been expected to give his collection to a mainland museum. Instead, he chose M+ in Hong Kong. So in the creation of these cultural hubs, securing collections from major private collectors is an enormous part of what the future will be, and it's enormously competitive. Many of these cultural hubs are being planned around museums. And I want to spend a bit of time on this because on the face of it, this is such a curious phenomenon in an age when people have more choices than ever before about how to spend their leisure. When once they would have traveled to see the world, now the world comes to them via the satellite, via television, via the internet, conveniently delivered to their laptops and their smartphones. Why on earth would you traipse around a museum if most of the stuff you can see there is available at the click of a mouse? But the statistics seem to show that museums are still incredibly important. Globally, their numbers have certainly burgeoned, from 23,000 2 decades ago to at least 55,000 now. In 2012, American museums received 850 million visitors, nearly 25% more than a decade ago. Now, granted, population has grown, but even so, that's more than all the big league sporting events and theme parks combined. In England, over half the adult population visited a museum or gallery in the past year, the highest figure since the government began collecting statistics. In Sweden, 3 out of 4 adults go to a museum at least once a year. In Paris, the Louvre, the world's most popular museum, had 10 million visitors last year, 1 million more than in 2011. China will soon, or may even already, have 4,000 museums. It's still only a quarter of the number of America, but they're racing to catch up. I don't want to spend a lot of time on China because Claire Jacobson, who knows probably more about this than anybody in the world, will be talking to us later. But when I was there last summer, An Laixun, the vice president of the China Museums Association, told me that in 2012, a record number of new museums were opened in China, 451. So museums are really going through a golden global age. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. Some of it has to do with changes in demand. In the rich world and in some developing countries, the proportion of people who are going on to higher education has risen enormously. And better educated folk are more likely to be museum goers. They want to see for themselves where they fit in the wider world, and they look to museums for guidance. In the developed world, museums are being championed by a huge variety of interest groups. City fathers like Georges Pompidou, who see iconic buildings and great collections as a tourist draw. Urban planners like the mayor of Bilbao, who hope that museums will act as a magic wand to bring blighted city areas back to life. By the media, who like to hype blockbuster exhibitions. By rich people who want to put their wealth in the service of philanthropy, or as a naughty museum director called it to me last year, it's a good way for rich people to launder their souls. For young people, amazingly, museums seem to be a source of something really authentic when their electronic entertainments start to pall. Now, in the more affluent parts of the developing world, museum building is being driven mainly by governments. They want to see their countries as being regarded as culturally sophisticated. They see museums as symbols of confidence, as sources of public education, places where a young country can present a cohesive national narrative. The number of museums around the world is growing exponentially. So in the midst of all this euphoric ordering of cement, what will be the problems of the next 10 years? In China and the Middle East, where museums seem to be springing up like weeds, the challenges are many and absolutely mind-numbing. What to put in these museums? Who will run them? Where will the curators be trained? Will there be enough local people interested in becoming curators? More difficult, certainly for the governments in charge, will be the question of debate and discussion. How much and how openly will you let your populations debate the issues of the day? In the developed world, debate is also an issue. Things have changed so much since the 19th century, since the days of a man called Benjamin Ives Gilman. For 30 years, Gilman was secretary of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And he was a man who argued that museums had a holy purpose. Collections should be contemplated for their aesthetic qualities alone, with no need for narrative, context, explanation, anything. The best place to do that, he said, was in a museum, because a museum is in essence a temple. Fast forward 100 years to the writings of Kenneth Hudson, a trend spotter, but he was a particular specialist on museums. And in a book called Museums of Influence, Kenneth Hudson wrote that the most fundamental change that has affected museums is the now almost universal conviction that they exist in order to serve the public. Museums are still showcases for collections, but they've also become pits of popular debate. They're places where children go for sleepovers. You can go once a year to the British Museum with your kids and spend the night in the Egyptian gallery sleeping with the mummies. So no longer should museums be places where people look on in awe, as they did in Gilman's day, but they're places to learn, to argue, just as if you were in a university or in an art school. As Nick Sirota from the Tate says, a museum today must be a forum as well as a treasure box. A lot has been done about this in the developed world, but not enough. And some of this comes down to funding, though not quite in the way that you might expect. You hear an enormous amount in Britain, I suspect more there than you do here, about cuts in funding. But my anecdotal evidence, or my anecdotal experience of interviewing people for the survey in all sorts of museums in all kinds of countries, has been that the most conservative museums, the most tired institutions, the ones with the fewest ideas, tended oddly to be museums that exist only or very, very largely on public funding. In Berlin, which has had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to make real a unique vision about museums, culture is regarded as something that is provided by the state and only by the state. So the opportunity to build the great Humboldt Forum that would unite the city and bring together all its incredible cultural institutions may very well never be completed, because the debates about it are taking place among civil servants and among politicians and not among the public. The most energetic museums, in contrast, seem to be the ones where public funding and private funding go hand in hand, levering each other, where the funds are used by a team of directors and curators with real vision and imagination. These are also the people who are the best, it seems, at asking the longer-term questions, of which the most important is who will be the visitors of the future. In the developed world, museum going is predominantly a white, middle-class, middle-aged occupation, a pastime for the relatively prosperous. What will they do in America, for example, where museums are not free? In New York, it costs $25 for an adult ticket to the Museum of Modern Art. Now, MoMA is a not-for-profit organization. It gets a lot of tax breaks for that, as do other American museums. But as municipal budgets come under pressure in American cities like Detroit, so will the rich and not-for-profit organizations may find that their charitable status comes under real threat. And what also will American museums do as the population changes? A third of Americans today come from minorities. Only 9% of museum visitors do. By 2030, half the American population will be from minorities. This is a question which is not only about America, it's about everywhere else in the world. Museums have to act if their communities are to feel intellectually and emotionally connected to them. If not, their visitors will just drift away. Now, I'm coming to the end, and I want to leave you not with a grand idea, but with a small example, because I'm very curious about what you think about it here. It has to do with visitors and the future. It has to do with technology. It has to do with philanthropy. Again, it's about America. In New York and Chicago, entrance fees to museums form a large part of their income. But that's not necessarily the case in other cities. When the Dallas Museum of Art realized that its entrance fees amounted to no more than 2% of its income, the trustees approved a radical new scheme. It began a year ago. Visitors to the museum would sign up electronically to a membership program known as DMA Friends for the Dallas Museum of Art. It gave them free admission if they provided their names, email addresses, and zip codes. They don't have to give their home address, they don't have to give any details of their income, just name, email, and zip code. For that, they get an app on their phones which tells them absolutely everything that's going on in the museum. And every public room in the DMA is linked into this electronic system. So the DMA can see how many people are in any given room at any given moment. And in return, the friends earn rewards, they're bonus points, like air miles. If you bring 10 friends, you get 20,000 points and a private tour. If you visit the museum 10 times in a year, 10 is obviously a big threshold in Dallas, you get 300 points and a special badge that says you're an art addict. I called the DMA last week before I came here, and they told me they had just signed up their 50,000th friend. The personal information that these people provide, name, email, and zip code, is overlaid with details from the census and from all other publicly available information. And this allows the museum to work out just who their visitors are and exactly which part of the city they come from. Now, Dallas, like a lot of other American cities, is divided by wealth, it's divided by race, it's divided by all sorts of things. But how many, they can see, how many people live in prosperous zip codes might become donors. How many people come from the poorest parts of the city, areas that might have 90% minority populations, and some of the city's poorest schools. Seeing which areas are underrepresented among their visitors allows the museum to go into the schools, into those areas, talk to the children about what a museum might mean to them and to their community, and what they might get for it if only they came into it for the first time for themselves. Philanthropists love the Friends School. It's results-oriented, and it makes the use of their money much more transparent. One donor has just given them $9 million to help roll it out further. It seems in every way a win-win situation. But when I described this program to the museum directors in Berlin, I cannot tell you the shock on their faces. Against the background of Edward Snowden's revelations and the news that the Americans had been tapping into Angela Merkel's mobile, the Dallas Museum's attempt to use technology to draw in its community seemed to to the German museum directors like the very, very worst example of the Brave New World. Tell me afterwards what you think. Thank you very much.